economic issues, right? And so that means employment discrimination, housing, and other structural issues. So my name is Craig Johnson. Again, I'm with the Chicago Black Gay Men's Caucus, where I serve as chair. Our mission there is to empower Black gay and bisexual men, as well as reduce the number of new HIV incidents. So I just want to create a quick framework for this panel, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists. I think we've had a number of sources, whether it's the Illinois or Chicago Departments of Public Health, the Illinois Poverty, Report on Illinois Poverty. As many of you all know, the Morton Group did a community needs assessment in the LGBT community. And so, again, there's tons of almost unanimity around what are some of the key points where Black LGBTs experience inequalities and discrimination. Kim's panel talked this morning about health. Michael's panel just talked about criminal justice. But in addition to that, let's add to that list. So we're talking about employment status. We're talking about homelessness. We're talking about education level. We're talking about access to government benefits, rights and services, and community safety and violence, right? So we're going to take a half hour, because that alone is like a year's worth of activity. But we're going to take the next half hour and just hop into these issues. As I set this stage, I want to point out, and I know that some of the panelists can speak more in detail about it, there's a report that came out just last month that highlighted key obstacles to discrimination among LGBTs of color. The three main points that were identified in the report are educational barriers, hiring bias, and on-the-job discrimination, and then number 3 is unequal pay, benefits, and taxation. One of the solutions or remedies that's been floating around is the Employment Non-Discrimination Act from a federal standpoint. We know that it's passed through the Senate, and ironically, with bipartisan support from both Dick Durbin as well as Mark Kerr. So there's some implications there in terms of, we know that there's been a push to make a difference and try to create protections around folks as it relates to sexual orientation. Much more needs to be done, and of course, if Boehner doesn't ever call the bill to the House floor, what happens then? And so this is, again, another point, or at least a remedy that is well underway and could certainly serve as a case study for moving forward. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Channyn Parker, who is with Chicago House and the Trans Life Center. Next to Channyn is Amara Enyia, who is principal at ACE Municipal Partners. And to her left is Mona Noriega, who's the commissioner for the city's Commission on Human Relations. So please welcome them. And before I ask them, so I've asked them to just take a few minutes to introduce themselves, talk about their organizations, and then to make the connections to many of the issues that I've just outlined. All right, and so if we can begin right here with Channyn.
Sure, absolutely. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We have been in a lot of passionate discussion. So I'm Channyn Parker, and I am the care coordinator for the Trans Life Project. I also work in Cook County Department of Corrections with special populations, which are transgender women of color. Wow, where to begin? Feels like we can go on with this forever. So basically, the basis of our advocacy stems from the historical understanding that transgender women of color in particular face a myriad of barriers. A lot of those barriers really stem from the lack of cohesion as far as laws are concerned, state to state, county to county, even as far as the DMV is concerned, from Social Security to birth certificate to ID. So that creates a perfect storm of lack of resources, lack of employment, lack of housing, so on and so forth. Because a lot of these lacks start off with proper identification. So therein lies the crux of the problem that most trans people face. The bigger problem that the Trans Life Project seeks to remedy are helping people navigate the legal system, helping people obtain proper employment, medical care, housing. So what my role is, what I'm charged at is, I do somewhat of brief, intensive case management with transgender women of color. And I help them navigate these systems that they found so many barriers in. So that's me in a nutshell, pretty much. And I know as we continue to have conversation, we'll expand more on topics.
Good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank this body for having me. I think the information from all of the earlier panels has just been extremely enriching, and so I've been learning a lot and just taking it all in. So it's really a privilege to be here. Again, my name is Amara Enyia. I am the CEO of ACE Municipal Partners. We do municipal consulting. We work primarily with mayors, city managers, city presidents of small to mid-sized cities in the Chicago, Northwest Indiana area, but we also have a couple of international projects in Central America, South America, and in West Africa. A lot of our work is around public policy, specifically around economic development. So we do a lot of economic development related work, but we also have work in housing and education, in manufacturing, and just different policy areas. And so our goal is really to help cities address their most pressing needs by offering them strategic policy and implementation. And so that's what we do. My role here is really to talk from an economic standpoint about the concerns and the issues that are relevant to the LGBTQ community, of which there are many, but there are also a lot of things that are going on that we can connect to really better understand how, from a policy standpoint, we can begin to make inroads in addressing some of those most pressing issues.
Hi, thank you. This is an amazing group of people here. The information's been incredible, and I have really liked the focus on policy. And so, leading with that perspective, I want to say that policy really is about establishing the importance of and creating opportunities to put that policy into effect. So, for example, we would say that the City of Chicago has a policy, has prioritized civil rights, and has had provided for a mechanism by which complaints of discrimination can be filed. The city has prioritized 15 protected classes, and when we talk about legislation, it's really important to understand that it's our aldermen, when we talk about at the city level, that identify what those protected classes will be. And so most recently, we had an additional protected class that actually sailed through all by, there was no concern about this protected class, and that's credit history. And so you cannot be not hired based on your credit history. You cannot, if you see in the newspaper, only the employed apply, that is no longer legal. That's a prohibited activity. And so to see policy affected legislatively, that is how that happens. Now, to get gender and sexual orientation, that was also legislative action. But that took a big fight. That took many, many years of people in this room who had to fight for that. And so there are some differences about how that happens, but policy-wise, there is a body by which citizens can come, or not citizens, but anybody can come to the commission and file a complaint of discrimination.
So one of the things that I want to ask is, in terms of disparities, you know, where do you see particular disparities in the areas that you work? For example, and if we were to start with Mona, you know, where do you see from from the standpoint of discrimination complaints or grievances that are filed as it relates to housing or as it relates to, you know, employment, are you seeing trends over the past couple of years? And do you see particular remedies from the city's standpoint that could be coming up in the near future to address those?
Well, okay, so we, as of like the second week in December, we have received 237 complaints of discrimination in the city of Chicago. Now, the city of Chicago is small. You know, 237 complaints of discrimination, that's a very, I would suggest that we're not taking full advantage of the opportunities to file, to seek remedies when we face discrimination. The highest category that we receive complaints on are around public accommodations. And the basis of those complaints, because we live intersectional lives, are mostly based on disability, but then it's followed by race and followed by sex. The second largest category in which we receive complaints of discrimination are around housing. And the basis of that is based on source of income, followed by race. And then employment actually is the third largest category, and that's based on race, followed by sex. I would suggest that I know that there is a movement to have formerly incarcerated records as a protected class, and I would suggest that if people want that, they've got to go to their alder people to make that a reality. That is about putting into effect legislative action and making the politicians work for us. I read the report that you had suggested. I don't know if everybody read it though, or is anyone familiar with this report?
How many people are actually familiar with that report on LGBT people of color and discrimination?
Okay.
So, about a
Okay,
third of the room.
Yeah, so, you know, I can just speak real briefly to some of the, I read it, you asked me to speak to it.
Please.
And so, it lists some of the gaps in federal protections, and although there are gaps in federal protections around sexual orientation and gender identity, that's not true here in the state or in the city. And so although many of these publications talk about that as a gap, that is a protection that we have here in the city and the state. And again, it's due to legislative in the organizing of people in this room, really. The other thing they talked about as a gap is the legal ties to children, and that the lack of protections therefore that occur. And again, we have those protections here in the state of Illinois, and we have those protections here in the city of Chicago. And so we need to exercise those. And then of course, marriage equality. You know, they talk about that as a federal, at the federal level as a gap, but now here in the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, we do have that as a protection. So we need to make sure that we exercise what those rights and responsibilities are so that our families are protected. One of the obstacles they talk about in here are bullying in the schools, an obstacle to education. And I want to say that our office, we have a small department in which we try to address bullying. And so this year we've done about maybe 55 bullying workshops in CPS. And you know, it's not, oftentimes the schools will call us as a result of some sort of bullying action. And so what our staff will do is they'll go in and they'll do a training for the staff, they'll do trainings with the kids, and most recently we've created a training for the parents, so the parents can intervene when they recognize. And what we try to do is we talk about the signs of being bullied or being a bully, and give parents the opportunities to role play advocating for their child within the CPS system, so that they can be responsible and take control of what's happening to their children. We've expanded it now to the parents. We're able to do it in English and Spanish, and we're next doing cyberbullying, so that, because you know, we're really seeing a lot of violence as a result of that. One other thing they talked about in here was barriers to filing complaints, and they talked a lot about the EEOC, and that it takes all this time for an investigation to occur. I would encourage you that if you have a complaint of discrimination, that you seek, that government is most responsive at the local level, and so therefore I would suggest that you file a complaint with the city, the county, or the state, and that and that you might get a quicker kind of response. You have to understand that the investigations are guided by the legal rights and parameters, and so therefore when you file a complaint, there is a certain amount of time that is given to the respondent to offer their defense. And so to be sure that everyone's rights and all sides of the issue are heard, there is a lot of time built into that, and that is really kind of why sometimes it takes so long. But it is an administrative hearing process. It follows a court process. If you're not happy with the result, you can appeal to the circuit court. But for the most part, remedies are found when you file a complaint, but you've got to file a complaint. I would suggest that the number of complaints that we see do not in any way indicate the level of discrimination that's occurring in our city.
Let me ask you, and then we'll just come back this way, on a couple of things. One is, if we were to look at youth, you know, Lord knows when I was growing up, there was no Center Halsted. There were no LGBT student associations in high schools or middle schools. Now there are significant NCPS and charter schools and private schools. You know, are you seeing, or how do you feel that is making a difference? Do you feel from a bullying standpoint that those support mechanisms are helping to contain and educate internally, or they're helpful but not as much, and that there needs to be more done in terms of raising awareness and looking at things from a policy standpoint?
You know, I would suggest that we can't do enough. I mean, there's not. We need to continue to work on that. But I will say that working with the parents, boy, it really, sometimes you get the parents in a room and they are not clear on what bullying is, especially in Spanish-speaking communities. All the bullying education goes right above their head because they weren't even aware of what some of those words were, the trigger words. And so role modeling, encouraging the parents to role model inappropriate behaviors with their own children, as well as with CPS, and then to educate them that CPS does have a bullying policy, and to require their schools to adhere to that policy, how to hold the schools accountable. It really makes a really big difference. I can't tell you how grateful the parents are, and how actionable they feel that after they have some of these workshops. Some of the evaluations we receive are really just, you go, really, wow. It was really kind of heartwarming. I would say the other part of the working with the youth is making sure that youth feel available, that they can avail themselves to city services. And so whenever we have an opportunity to have groups come in to talk to us, I really encourage it. I really encourage anybody who has a group of youth that they want to talk to attorneys or to see role models who are advocating for civil rights, that they bring that group of kids into our office. And, you know, I will make staff available to them to understand what the legal process is and why it's so important.
I think I would, I'm going to take it back and just from an economic standpoint. And so one of the questions that you asked, and I agree, that we really can't do enough. I mean, there have been some advances made, but there's also certainly a long way to go. And so just in prepping for coming here, just jotting down some notes about what is the economic landscape as it relates to the LGBTQ community. One of the key barriers and obstacles is the perception, right? So when we think of the typical same-sex couple, what is it that comes to mind? So you have this battling with the image of, for example, Will and Grace, right? Is it Will and Grace? Mm-hmm. With, you know, we think, are they wealthy white males with probably have no children, doing very well for themselves? Mm-hmm. What could they possibly be having to do with economic disparity? And we know that that is absolutely not the case. And so, for example, not too many people know that for transgender individuals, they are 4 times as likely to live on incomes of under $10,000. You talked about youth. 1.6 million youth in this country are facing homelessness. Of that number, 20 to 40% identify as LGBTQ, right? So those are young people who are experiencing homelessness. There are another, as it relates to women. Women, we already face, by the way, I'm extremely glad to be on a panel of women, because I noticed we had a switch earlier. But as women, there are approximately 9 million LGBTQ individuals. Almost half of these are lesbian or bisexual women. 24% of those women are poor, compared with 19% of heterosexual women. And that is actually different from gay men, whose the number of poor are actually on par with other men. According to the Williams Institute, 1 in 5 members of same-sex couples are people of color, 1 in 8 are Latino, and they are 3 times more likely to be poor than their white counterparts. So we know that there's work to be done to dispel that myth that if you are a part of the LGBTQ community, you're just doing very well. The other thing is that a lot of same-sex couples are having children. So they're raising children. And so when your income is not where it could be and you're raising children, it puts even more strain. And the other group that I will speak to specifically is the immigrant population. Yes. How does this community work with and assist immigrants who come to this country, a lot of times coming from places where they will not have anything that we have here. And so I'm West African Nigerian. And anyone who knows what the conversations around LGBTQ are at home, right. Very different. In fact, we wouldn't be here, right? So right. When immigrants are coming to this country and they need that support group, how does this community deal with that, especially from an economic perspective? And so a lot of these things are about really emerging and highlighting this conversation, even as we advocate for economic investment in our communities. And so I do a lot of work on the south and west side of Chicago around economic investment, because that's the crux of all of these other issues, whether it's public policy, education, safety. They come from investment in the community. And so when people are talking about what they need in terms of investment, how are these issues that are specific to the LGBTQ community being represented? Are they being represented? Do we have sufficient collaboration amongst organizations who are speaking to these issues when they're at the table? Or is it that there are 2 conversations taking place? One, even with African Americans, but then African Americans and the LGBTQ community are having another conversation. Why would that be the case? It should not be the case. And so if we're talking about advocacy and really how can we move the needle from raising our economic standing in the LGBTQ community, how do we do that? I think that's a question that this group, especially dealing with public policy, really has to engage with.